Hello viewers, this is a follow-up video to Kinematics question 7. The 18L36R runway at Hamilton Airport is 2,059 meters long. So in this video we will explore the numbering system that they do use for runways. But before we do that, we need to know what bearings are. So bearings measure the angle going around clockwise from north. So north is an angle of 0, or for the purposes of this video, for the purposes of the runway numbering system, 360. East would be 90 degrees, south would be 180 degrees, and west would be 270 degrees. So let's have a look at 4 airports around the world. Let's have a look at their runways through Google Maps. And we're going to start with Hamilton Airport. So here we are at the southern end of the main runway at Hamilton Airport. And we see painted on the end of the runway 36R. So any planes landing at the southern end must be traveling northbound. This must be the case because a plane needs to touch down at the beginning end of the runway so that they've got the full length of the runway to decelerate so that they do not go off the end of the runway. The other thing to note here is that on a runway, planes can travel in both directions, although hopefully not at the same time. A runway is not a one-way. So we have 36R, and we see that because any plane landing at this end of the runway is traveling northbound. North has a bearing of 360 for the purposes of this video. And what they do is they take the bearing of the direction in which the plane is heading, and they drop the last digit. So 360, drop the 0, we get 36. And as we're facing north, this is the right-hand runway, hence the R. As we taxi up the runway, we will see on our left here another tiny runway. Here we see 36L on this runway. This 36 tells us again we're facing northbound, and this is the left-hand runway that we see as we're facing northbound. Now, when we reach the other end, this is the northern end. This is where any plane that's traveling southbound will land. South has a bearing of 180, drop the 0, and we get a number 18. As you're facing southbound, so looking at this image upside down, this main runway is the left-hand runway you'd see, and you would see the tiny 18R, the runway that has 18R on your right-hand side. Now, this is not a exactly north-south facing runway. In fact, it's a little bit more, but it's around 20 degrees to the clockwise direction of north-south. So really, the numbering system they should be using here would be, because this is a 20-degree bearing, roughly, that this should be 2R, which would make this 2L, indicating 20 degrees. Of course, the numbering system, as we've said, they drop the last 0. And this would be the opposite direction. So to get the bearing of the opposite direction, we need to add 180 degrees to 20 degrees. So really this should be 200, drop the last 0, that should be 20L, and that should be 20R if they were taking into account the exact direction that the runway was facing instead of just saying northbound versus southbound. Now let's have a look at another airport from around the world. Let's have a look at Heathrow Airport, which has runways, 2 runways that are pointed in the east-west direction. So here we are at the, let's zoom out a little bit so we can see where both runways are. So we have one runway at the top here, and we have another runway down at the bottom of the screen here. So let's look at the top runway and we'll zoom into the western end, which is where any eastbound planes will land, will touch down. So because the plane is traveling eastbound, we're looking at a bearing of 90 degrees. Drop that last 0, we get 9. And as we're heading eastbound, this will be the left runway we see. Let's taxi down the runway to the other end. First of all, down the other end here, that's where any westbound planes will land. And west has a bearing of 270. Dropping that 0, we get 27. So we're expecting the number at the other end of the runway to be 27. And if we're looking at from the eastbound direction looking west, so looking west, we are going to see this top runway as being the right-hand runway. So at the other end of this runway, we should see 27 Rs. And if when we reach that end, there we have it, 27R. Now the other runway will be, as we're looking at it from the east, so looking towards the west, we will see this bottom runway on the left. So this other runway will be the 27L runway. And at the western end of this one, we should see 9R, because looking at it from the western side, looking eastbound, this will be the right-hand runway that we see. And there it is. The bottom runway would be the 9R27L runway, and the top runway here would be the 9L27R runway. Let's also have a look at JFK Airport in New York. So we see that here the direction in which the runways are oriented. It's close to being northeast. It's a little bit more north than east. So it would be pointing in a bearing of around 40 degrees. Drop that last digit, we're expecting to see the number 4 on the end of the runway. And there we have 4L. Because the runway is a lighter color, it's a little bit harder to see. So this is one runway, and over here we have the other runway, which, as you see, is the 4R runway. So let's head over to the other end of the runway. First of all, any plane that's heading in the opposite direction is going to be traveling in a bearing of around 40 plus 180. Add the 180 to get the bearing of the opposite direction. So 40 plus 180 is 220. Drop that last 0, we get 22. So we're expecting the number on the other end of the runway to be 22. And if we are heading southbound, so we are looking at this map in the upside down, then we would expect this to be the right-hand runway and this one to be the left-hand runway. So we would expect at the other end of this runway there to be 22R, and at the other end of this runway we would expect to see 22L. So let's check whether that's indeed what we do see. So we've probably gone a bit too far. There we see 22R. So that's what we expect. And if we have a look at the end of the other runway, here we see 22L. So that's exactly as we expect. Now, we have at this airport, this is an interesting case because we also have 2 perpendicular runways. We see over here a 31R, so going in this direction, would be a bearing of around 310 degrees. Drop that last 0, 310 dropping that last digit, we get 31. And way back here we see the other runway, the 31R runway, when we find it, which will be there. So that's the 31L runway, and any planes traveling along this runway in the opposite direction will be, if we subtract 180 this time, because adding 180 would take us over 360, subtract 180 to get from 310 to get 130. So the number we're expecting to see at the other end of this runway would be 130, drop that last 0, 13. So if we head to the other end of this runway, we expect to see 13, and if we're looking at it from the opposite direction, so looking roughly in towards the southeast direction, we would expect that to be the right-hand runway. So at the other end of this runway, we would expect to see 13R. So that would make this the 31L 13R runway. And let's taxi to the other end of the runway to make sure that that is what occurs, that this is indeed the 13R runway. And there it is there. So let's look at the other top runway, the one parallel to this, and we should find at the other end of that runway, we should find 13L, which would be at the end of this runway here. So 13L there. Perfect. Okay, so there's one other thing that we should consider. At the moment, it looks like runways always appear in pairs. So any runway has any airport has an even number of runways, but that's not necessarily the case. So we see at this airport, which is the Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, this one actually has 5 runways. So we can see that the pair on screen is facing in the, so the runways here are oriented in the east-west direction, where at the western end of the 9L, 9R pair. So 9L is this top runway, and 9R at the bottom at this bottom runway. So the top runway we're expecting to be just like Heathrow, the 9L 27R runway, and the bottom runway will be the 9R 27L runway. And there, well, we can see that the tires of the planes have worn out the R, but that doesn't indeed say 9R there. So let's taxi down the other end of this pair of runways, and we are expecting to see on the end of this one 27R, on the end of that one 27L. So there we see 27L, and this runway is a little bit longer. There we see the 27R we are expecting. So that is the main pair of runways at this Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. But if we zoom out a little bit, we will see another pair of runways over to the north. So we've got another pair of runways, and they are parallel to the original pair, but instead of labeling them the 9R, 9L, because this pair is to the north of the other pair, this is actually called the 8L and 8R pair of runways. So again, so what number are we expecting at the other end of these two runways? Well, the opposite direction, so they're saying first of all that the bearing of that any plane landing at this western end is heading would be a bearing of around 80 degrees. Drop that last 0 and we get 8. So this is 8L, 8R, and as we're looking towards the east, we would see this to be the left runway of the two and this to be the right runway of the two. So we're saying the bearing is around 80 degrees to make the numbering different from the 9L, 9R pair of runways that we've just had a look at. Now, the opposite direction would be add 180 to 80, we get 260. So we would expect a 26 to be at the other end of this runway. So at the other end over here, we're expecting to see 26R. And at the other end of this one, we're expecting to see 26L. So let's check whether that is indeed what we get. That would mean the top runway here is the 8L 26R, and the bottom runway here would be the 8R 26L. So as we taxi to the other end of this pair of runways, and this top one is certainly heavily worn. It is hard to, in fact, see it. There it is. So we see 26R there. And on this one, we should see 26L. Let's scroll a little bit further. There we go, 26L there. Okay, so that's 4 runways at the Hartsfield-Jackson and Atlanta International Airport. There is a 5th one. There is another one that's unpaired. So this is the 9 and 27 pair that we looked at before. But somewhere over to the south here, we see one more runway, which is not paired up with another one. So this is, because it's to the south of the main runway, which is the middle one, the first one we looked at, which was the 9 and 27 pair, this is going to be the 10 runway. And because it is not paired up with anything, it is not the 10R or the 10L, it's just runway 10. Now, what number are we expecting to see at the other end of this runway? So 10 meaning it would be a bearing of around about 100, give or take, in the normal numbering system. So 100 plus 180 degrees to reverse the direction. We're expecting to see 28 at the other end of this runway. And that's indeed what we do see here. Thanks for watching. Over and out.